I always sat in the second row, never the front, never the back. Close enough to hear him speak without straining, far enough to not be noticed more than necessary. Mr. Rehan taught literature like it was a religion. His voice didn't just explain stories. It lived inside them. The way he spoke about grief, love, and loss made it feel like he wasn't just teaching us, he was remembering something. I was in my final year. Quiet by nature, mostly invisible to the world around me. I wrote poetry in the margins of my notebooks, hoping no one would ever find it, but he did. One afternoon, while returning a graded essay, he paused, his finger brushing over the side margin where I had scribbled a few lines about loneliness. He said nothing then, just looked at me, too long to be casual, too short to be inappropriate. The next day he called me to stay after class. My heart thudded in my chest as the last few students filed out. He didn't make small talk, didn't waste time. You wrote this, he said, showing me the poem. I nodded, unsure whether to feel embarrassed or proud. It's raw, but real. You write like someone who's lived twice their age. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. He smiled softly, not like a teacher, more like someone who recognized something familiar. I hold writing workshops, sometimes after hours. Not official. Just a few students, if you're interested. I agreed before I fully processed what I was agreeing to. Maybe it was the way he said it, like he wasn't offering it to just anyone, like it meant something. That Friday, I found myself outside the small reading room near the back of the library. It was an old space, rarely used. The windows were high and narrow, dust drifting lazily through golden slants of afternoon light. It smelled like forgotten paper and old wood. He was already there, seated by a round table, sleeves rolled up, a mug of tea in his hand. You came, he said, like he wasn't entirely expecting me to. I wasn't sure you meant it. He smiled again, that same quiet smile that never quite reached his eyes. I meant it. We didn't write much that first session. Mostly talked about authors, about what loneliness felt like when it had no name, about how words were the only way some people could breathe. I told him I often felt like a ghost in my own life. He didn't flinch at that. He just nodded and said, "Ghosts are only those the world refuses to see. Sometimes they're the most alive of us all." From that day on, our meetings became regular. Never announced, never discussed, but always understood. I stopped feeling nervous around him, not because the feelings faded, but because they grew into something steadier, something more dangerous. His compliments weren't loud. They came in the form of lingering glances, in the way he remembered my exact phrasing from weeks before. In the silence he allowed to sit between us without needing to fill it. I began to notice things. The way he'd tap his thumb against his mug when deep in thought, how he smelled like sandalwood and paper, how he sometimes stared at the window for too long, like he was somewhere else entirely. I wanted to ask what he was thinking about. I never did. One evening I arrived to find only a candle burning on the desk. The lights had gone out in half the building. He said we could cancel, but I sat anyway. We talked under the flicker of that candle, our shadows dancing against the old walls like ghosts who finally found each other. I asked him if he believed in fate. He said he didn't, but he paused before saying it like he wanted to. When I left that night, the sky was navy and silent. The cool air clung to my skin, but inside, something warm had taken root. I didn't know what we were or what we were becoming. All I knew was that I had begun measuring my days by how close they brought me to those quiet hours alone with him. I didn't tell anyone. Some things felt too sacred for the noise of the outside world. But even then, I knew when things are kept in silence too long, they either die or explode, and somehow, I already knew ours wouldn't die quietly. It became a rhythm we both pretended didn't exist. I'd arrive just after the bell, sometimes with a printed poem in hand, sometimes with nothing but a restless silence. Rehan never asked why I came back. He only asked what I was carrying that die in words, in weight, in wounds. There was something unspoken in our meetings that made time dissolve. Hours passed like whispers. The reading room evolved. It was no longer just bookshelves and candlelight. It was filled with breath held between glances, sentences that felt heavier than they should. Sometimes we talked about literature. Sometimes we talked about nothing. But always, we talked like we were afraid someone would overhear a truth neither of us had dared to say aloud. One evening, as rain licked the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, Rehan asked, "Do you ever feel like you're becoming someone no one around you really knows?" I looked at him too long. All the time. He nodded, his gaze fixed on a book spine, but I could tell he heard something in my voice. He had that rare kind of presence that made silence feel like a conversation. When he finally looked back at me, his eyes weren't just thoughtful, they were searching, as if he was asking a question without shaping it into words. That night, the electricity had gone again. We sat close, sharing the glow of a small desk lamp running on backup power. As I read him a piece I'd written about someone waiting in a room that no one ever entered, his hand slowly drifted to rest near, mine not touching, just near. close enough to feel like a dare. When I finished, the quiet lingered. That one felt personal, he said. Asterisk it was. Asterisk he didn't speak right away. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual. I shouldn't say this, but I look forward to these nights more than I should. Asterisk his words sat between us like a flame. And, still, our hands didn't move, but everything else did in my heart. The air, the rules I thought we were following. Asterisk, what does that mean? I asked, and I wasn't just asking for clarity, I was asking for courage. Asterisk Rayhan didn't answer. Instead, he stood and crossed to the bookshelf, pulling down a worn copy of a translated Rumi collection. He opened it without looking at the pages, his eyes still far away. Asterisk, I used to think I could keep things simple. Be who I'm supposed to be, and that would be enough. Asterisk, and now? Asterisk, he didn't answer that either, just closed the book and set it down beside me. Asterisk, when he finally looked at me again, it wasn't the look of a teacher. It wasn't even the look of a friend. It was a look that carried weight, 1,000 things unsaid. Emotions edited down like unfinished drafts. Asterisk, I should have left. I knew it, but I did. I 10 single quotes to asterisk. Another week passed. The distance between our hands narrowed. The air got heavier, filled with the tension of a story waiting to be written. He didn't touch me. Not yet, but he looked at me like he wanted to. Like doing so would ruin everything and save something at the same time. Asterisk one night. I stayed later than usual. The campus was nearly empty. I handed him a piece I hadn't dared show anyone else. It was about longing, about quiet love, about looking at someone and knowing you can't say what you feel. Asterisk Rehan read it silently. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression. Asterisk, you know this is dangerous, right? Asterisk, I know, I whispered. But I don't know what else to do with this. Asterisk, his eyes held mine. Neither do I. Asterisk still. No one made a move, not physically. But something had undeniably passed between Usan understanding. A surrender. He didn't tell me to stop coming, and I didn't stop. Asterisk, but something in the room had changed. The pauses between words grew longer. The way his gaze lingered on my face no longer felt accidental. He once brushed a strand of hair off my forehead, then froze, realizing what he'd done. I saw his throat tighten, his hands clench. Asterisk, we never talked about that touch. Asterisk, that night. As I left the room, the storm outside had faded. But inside me, something else had begun. A quiet, gnawing ache. The kind that came not from rejection but from knowing that something fragile had finally cracked. Asterisk, and I knew then, without needing to ask, that we had crossed a line. One neither of us could admit to, but both of us had already stepped over. Asterisk. Winter came early that year, as if the cold was trying to warn us. The first frost crept over the windows of the reading room, painting delicate patterns where the light used to spill freely. Our meetings became quieter, as if the season demanded restraint. But the silence wasn't just outside anymore. It had made its way between us, pressing into every glance, every paused sentence. Asterisk Rehan looked tired, not in the physical sense, but the way someone does when they've been holding too much in for too long. He smiled less. He touched his papers. More, rearranging things that didn't need arranging. I could feel the edges of him pulling away, even though we sat only inches apart. Asterisk, are you okay? I asked once, unsure if I had the right to know anymore. Asterisk, I'm fine, he replied, and I could hear the weight of everything he didn't say. Asterisk, there was a distance growing slow, invisible, but constant. I tried to fill it with better poems, longer conversations, small jokes that used to make him laugh, but he only smiled faintly now, like he was somewhere else in his mind. Asterisk then. One evening, the shift became undeniable. Asterisk, we were reviewing a short story I had written, one about a boy who falls for someone he shouldn't. The metaphors were thinly veiled, the feelings, less so. As I read aloud, Rehan stared at the floor, his expression unreadable. When I finished, the silence stretched far too long. Asterisk, it's beautiful, he finally said, softly. But it's not just fiction, is it? Asterisk, I didn't answer. My heartbeat had found its way into my throat. Asterisk, I think we've been pretending we're still safe. He continued, voice strained. But we're not. And I don't think we ever were. I lowered my gaze, the weight of his words pressing into my chest. You're not a student to me anymore, he said. And that's the problem. Asterisk, I wanted to speak, but there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like pleading. He stood and walked toward the bookshelf, the same one he always went to when avoiding eye contact. But this time, he stayed there. Asterisk, we can't keep doing this, he said, barely above a whisper. Asterisk, it wasn't a confession. It was a goodbye dressed as a boundary. Asterisk, the days after blurred into one another. The reading room stayed locked. He stopped acknowledging me in class, his eyes passing over me as if I were part of the war. My poems sat unread in my bag. I felt like a chapter he had closed too early, a sentence he'd edited out to keep the narrative safe. Asterisk, and yet, the tension didn't leave. It only changed shape. Asterisk rumors began to whisper through the corridors. A classmate mentioned seeing us leave the reading room late one evening. Another asked casually if I had a special connection with Mr. Rayhan. I laughed it off. But inside, I burned with fear and shame. Asterisk, he never spoke of it. Neither did I, but I could tell he heard the rumors too, his steps quicker, his voice firmer, his walls higher. I began wondering whether I had imagined it all. The glances, the warmth, the closeness, but then came the note, folded and left in the margin of a book I borrowed from the school library. I recognized the handwriting. Before I opened it, just one line. It meant something. I just don't know how to live with it. It broke me more than silence ever could. The next day he acted like nothing had happened, but I couldn't. I found myself staring at him in class, wondering if he felt the same ache, if he regretted the nearness or just the consequences. Asterisk then. One afternoon I saw him through the window talking to the principal, their voices low, their expressions serious. I froze, a chill cutting deeper than any wind. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts circled back to one truth. If this ever became more than silence, more than glances and unfinished sentences, it could destroy us both. Asterisk, but hadn't it already? Asterisk, by the week's end, his name disappeared from the staff list. No announcements, no farewells, just absence loud and unforgiving. I walked into the reading room alone, dust beginning to settle again, as if trying to erase what had happened there. Asterisk, and still, I felt him in the quiet, in the pages he once touched, in the words we never said. Something was gone, yes, but something else, something broken and beautiful, still lingered, waiting to decide whether it would become memory or mistake. Asterisk, months passed like scattered pages, each one harder to keep track of than the last. Rehan's absence faded from the school corridors faster than I had expected, swallowed by new semesters, new faces, and the institution's quiet preference for forgetting. But for me, forgetting wasn't an option. I carried it all: his silence, his smile, the look in his eyes that night he said we weren't safe anymore. Asterisk, I stopped writing for a while. Words felt dishonest, even cruel. What could I say that wouldn't scratch open the parts of me still healing? Every sentence reminded me of him, of what wasn't allowed to be spoken, of what we both wanted and walked away from. Love, when forbidden, doesn't die cleanly. It lingers, echoing inside you, shaping your choices long after it's gone. Asterisk then, one rainy afternoon, I found myself wandering through the old campus building, instinct more than intention. My steps led me back to the reading room. It had changed. The desk had been moved. The curtains were drawn. The scent of dust hung in the air like it was waiting for someone to open a window again. Asterisk, I walked to the bookshelf, fingertips brushing spines like memories, and there, tucked between 2 volumes of poetry, was something new, a small journal. No name, just a black leather cover. My hands trembled as I opened it. Asterisk, his handwriting, still neat, still familiar. Asterisk, I didn't want to leave, but I had to. Asterisk, each page held pieces of him, scattered thoughts written in quiet desperation. He had written about the confusion, the fear, the guilt, but also about me, about the connection he couldn't explain and didn't want to erase. And then, near the end, one line stopped me cold. Asterisk, maybe one day, when we're not who we were, we can meet again, somewhere outside the rules. Asterisk, I sat with that line for a long time, the silence of the room settling over me like an old blanket. For the first time in weeks I allowed myself to cry. Not because it ended, but because something so real had ever begun at all. Asterisk, life moved forward, as it always does. I graduated, left the city. Time wrapped its soft hands around the sharpest parts of me. The story faded from memory for everyone else, but not for me. I kept the journal. I started writing again. Not about him, not directly, but about the feeling of being close to something true, then letting it slip through your fingers. Asterisk, years later. On a late summer evening, I stood in a quiet corner of a second-hand bookstore in another city. The kind of place Rehan would have loved, full of forgotten stories and whispered nostalgia. I was thumbing through a worn copy of Rumi when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned. He looked older, a little more lined, a little more grounded, but still unmistakably him. Asterisk, didn't think I'd ever see you again, I said, my voice catching somewhere between surprise and something softer. Asterisk, I didn't think I'd ever come back, he replied. Asterisk, there was a long pause, not awkward, just full. Asterisk, we walked together to a nearby cafe. We didn't talk about the past right away. We talked about books, about life, about how cities age without you. But eventually the silence curled around us again, the same way it used to, like a question waiting for its answer. Asterisk, did you find it? He asked, sipping his tea. Asterisk, the journal. Yeah, I found it. Asterisk, he smiled then, small and full of apology. I wanted to explain, but I thought silence would be ... safer. Asterisk, it wasn't, I said quietly, but I understand. He nodded. The sun dipped low behind the windows. The light between us grew golden, soft. I didn't know what we were, now strangers, ghosts, something in between. But I knew one thing for sure. We weren't who we were, and maybe that was enough. Asterisk, before we parted, He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded page, another note. Asterisk this time. I'm not afraid. Asterisk I didn't open it right away. I let it sit in my hand, warm from his touch. Asterisk love doesn't always need a title or a clear path. Sometimes it's just two people finding each other again. A little older, a little braver, beneath the quiet weight of everything they once felt but couldn't keep. Asterisk, and in that silence, something finally healed. Asterisk.